Buenos días a todas y todos. Ya estamos pronto a iniciar. Ruego puedan tomar asiento y a quienes se unan vía web, bienvenidos también. Please, again, as yesterday, if you need, there will be translation available. So be sure to get your translation devices. And then give them back at the end of the sessions, please. We also want to remind you that we are on Twitter at OECD, or X as it's called now, at OECD Economy, M Economía, Mindrel-Chile, and at sobre-Chile. And also on LinkedIn at OECD Economy y Ministerio de Economía, Fomento y Turismo. As well, our hashtags, it's never bad to remind them, it's OECD GFP and OECD Chile. Thank you very much. I'll switch back to Spanish for the introduction. Estimado público presente, en nombre del Ministerio de Economía y el Ministerio de Relaciones Exteriores de Chile, les damos la más cordial bienvenida al segundo día de la Conferencia Anual del Foro Global de la OECD sobre Productividad, Nuevas políticas para un desarrollo productivo y crecimiento sostenibles. And back to English. We welcome Mr. Jared Sheeran. I hope you're connected, Jared. Director of Science, Technology and Innovation of the OECD Directorate. He joined the OECD in 2023 with 30 years of experience in developing and implementing policies for innovation, scientific data, and information technology in the United States. He served as co-chair of the U.S. National Science and Technology Council Subcommittee on Open Science, chair of the OECD Working Party on Innovation and Technology Policy, and is the U.S. delegate to the G7 Open Science Working Group. Jerry, you are live.
Buenos dias, bonjour, and good morning to all of you, dear participants and dear colleagues. It is truly my pleasure, my privilege to welcome you to the second day of the 2023 Annual Conference on the Global Forum on Productivity. As noted, I am the Director for Science, Technology, and Innovation at the OECD, where I've been for all of about 2.5 months right now. And I can tell you that OECD and the STI Directorate have a substantial and growing interest in these issues of productivity that you're discussing at the forum. Here in STI, our mission is to provide policy advice and analysis to help improve industrial performance broadly and in particular sectors like steel and shipbuilding. We aim to accelerate innovation, which is a key driver of productivity, as I'm sure you're discussing, and for advancing efforts at industrial decarbonization in support of our joint and our mutual climate-related ambitions. So I'm disappointed that I can't be there with you in person in Santiago today, but I am very pleased to be able to take advantage of this element of the digital transformation to be able to join you in a virtual format. And I give you very good wishes for good discussion today. As is clear, and you know at least as well as I, these issues of productivity and industrial transformation are increasingly important in the OECD and beyond. And they raise a number of very important questions and policy questions that need urgent answers. I think an important message from yesterday's discussions that bears repeating is that we can develop and implement policy mixes that can foster the sustainable and productive development of our economies. In other words, boosting productivity growth does not need to come at the expense of increased inequality or environmental degradation. We can have all three together. I think both Professor Hausmann's keynote address yesterday and the panel discussion among high-level representatives from Chile, Brazil, Costa Rica, and ECLAC provided insightful examples of industrial policies that can support these three objectives at the same time: productivity growth, inclusiveness, and progress toward net zero. Indeed, industry policy is making something of a comeback these days. Industry policy has been with us for a long time in one form or another, as either implicitly or explicitly governments continue and have long relied on a range of policy instruments that stimulate growth, industrial development and renewal, and resilience. And increasingly, there's an interest in using these policy measures and improving productivity and shifting industrial performance to better address societal challenges such as climate. And supporting industrial decarbonization is one area of particular interest. Just as an example from another part of my OECD DSTI portfolio, in the shipping area, we know that by 2050, in order to meet our net zero achievements, if we are to achieve these goals, we need every ship being contracted from today to be built to sail on or to be able to be quickly retrofit to alternative fuels, such as ammonia. We therefore need to analyze how industrial policies for shipbuilding can be turned toward the net zero transition and what sets of complementary policies we need to put in place to ensure broad infrastructure is needed to help support both imports as well as on ships a transition to net zero. Other OECD work is developing, proposing a practical framework to design more effective industrial strategies and gather data about them. The Quantifying Industrial Strategies, or QUIS project, uses a harmonized and commonly agreed methodology that allows benchmarking of industrial policies across countries along several important policy dimensions. We're beginning to see the first results of this project, and they highlight that already, on average, across 9 considered countries, sectoral policies represent almost 30% of the policy supports, whether grants or tax expenditures, between 2019 and 2021. By comparison, industrial policies with a green component, such as toward decarbonization, represented only about 15% of the expenditures, again, whether grants or taxes, during this time period. We know at the same time that industrial policies aimed at green issues and climate change are growing fast. Through this project, we've already quantified about 1.3 trillion US dollars of COVID recovery spending package, spending that's been directed toward low carbon technologies. A number of bottlenecks remain, of course. As I believe you all discussed yesterday, there are sizable financial resources that will have to come from the private and the public sector alike that are needed, and they need to be mobilized in order to achieve the green transition we envision. Interestingly, the transition to a net zero carbon economy is compatible with long-term productivity growth and economic opportunities for businesses. Short-term, the dynamics could be a little different though, in particular for some firms and in some sectors. We have OECD ongoing work that's assessing whether the dispersion in performance between firms in green is related to a dispersion in productivity. This would indicate a potential risk for the green transition to increase existing productivity divergence across firms, as has already been highlighted by work here in the Global Forum on Productivity. OECD analysis has also shown that the current pace of low carbon innovation is insufficient to meet carbon neutrality goals. Public R&D expenditures for low carbon technologies as a share of GDP have remained flat for essentially the last 20 years. Maybe more equally concerning, patent filings for tackling climate change are actually falling as the business sector focuses more on the often difficult process of diffusing and the commercializing existing technologies. So while we know that greater support to business R&D related to green technologies is one policy instrument that we can use to help fill the gap, we know we're going to need to do it maybe in some new and different and transformative ways. For example, we may need to rely on R&D supports that are more direct, prioritizing grants to businesses over tax credits and other procurement mechanisms that provide greater flexibility for business decision making, but don't necessarily provide enough emphasis to push in a green direction. We also know that this funding is going to be needed to focus on emerging technologies such as green hydrogen, long duration energy storage. These kinds of technologies currently receive less than 10% of the total public R&D funding for low carbon technologies. Our ability to increase these resources are going to be helpful, but they're of course not a panacea. I think the green energy transition, for instance, will require well-functioning global value chains and our ability to continue to secure required critical raw minerals. Certain minerals and materials lie at the heart of a low-carbon transition. This includes cobalt, nickel, and lithium, which are essential for electric vehicle batteries of today. Rare earth minerals that are critical for manufacturing wind turbines, and copper, which is essential to virtually all clean technologies, whether photovoltaic systems, wind turbines, electric cars, or others. Work within the OECD has shown that while no country yet appears to dominate in the extraction of these critical materials, the dominant role of some players emerges when you examine the rest of the value chain, in particular in the processing of these raw materials. I think our hosts today in Chile, of course, know this very well. And the issue of the resilience and trustworthiness of value chains was repeatedly brought up in yesterday's sessions of the GDC. As noted, successful policies should strive to anticipate future risks and disruptions by designing more robust production networks, including via the diversification of suppliers, foreign suppliers in particular. Diversification, however, may come at a cost in terms of economic efficiency and competitiveness of downstream industries. This is why diversification policies need to be considered to limit very specific and limited to specific segments of production networks. In other cases, innovation and even stockpiling represent alternative ways to obtain robust supply lines while preserving economic performance. Let me say finally, investments in a productive, greener, and more inclusive future, we know, can't exist without sound business investment. The interest in industrial policy and global value chain resilience can't come at the expense of a level global playing field, as supported by competition and trade policies. You're going to hear later today from the second keynote speaker, Professor Kalina Manova from the University College in London, how linkages to the international market can foster the transfer of knowledge across borders, support investment and innovation, and strengthen productivity growth. She will delve deeper into the role of institutions for financial development, and the panel that follows will focus on how competition and regulatory frameworks can ensure the efficient allocation of resources across firms. There's an urgent need to consider these issues now. Recent OECD work, for example, reveals a decline in business dynamism, increases in industry concentration and markups, and an increase in the number of mergers and acquisitions. OECD work is also investigating what might be causing these current changes. It may be possible that investment in digital technologies and some of the complementary and tangible assets are emerging as relevant factors. Not all firms can afford the initial costs of adoption, and not all firms can equally harness the benefits of such investments. Other OECD work provides evidence that we are beginning to see more polarized adoption of AI and digital technologies by firm size. We need to be concerned that greater adoption by larger and more productive firms may widen the existing gaps between leaders and the rest of the firm population. So effective competition and regulatory frameworks are an essential component of countries' strategies and their policy arsenal to close the productivity gap between frontier and lagging firms. I think Feliz and Federico delved into this yesterday in session number 1. And in that context, right, considerable emphasis was placed on the pivotal role played by human capital in fostering productivity growth and catch up with the frontier. Evidence from the work of the GFP team itself presented at the joint G20 and GFP conference that was held in 2021. You'll hear more on that theme in the last session of today, and that will also expand on yet another policy domain of relevance, that on the issue of skills and education, the role they play in maximizing the returns of technology adoption for both productivity and wage growth. That session will explore policies that enable the equitable distribution of productivity gains through wages and wage growth. and thereby bolstering income growth and inclusiveness. So to wrap up, in sum, I think today promises to be yet another exciting and enlightening day as you all continue to explore productivity from different angles and perspectives. I think you'll see and highlight the many different policy instruments and tools that we need to bring to bear to create the policy mix that will help us achieve greater productivity, greater inclusion, and help us achieve our aspirational climate-related goals. Thanks to you all for being part of this conference. Thanks to all for the contributions that you're making. I wish you an inspiring, and as I dare say, productive day ahead. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to open today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much for dialing in, Director, and we hope to see you in Chile soon. We now give the floor to our moderator, Luis Felipe Céspedes, member of the Board of the Central Bank of Chile. Between March 2014 and August 2017, Mr. Céspedes was Minister of Economy, Development and Tourism of Chile, having served as an expert economist both within the government and academia. He regularly publishes on macroeconomics, monetary and exchange policy, fiscal policy, real exchange rate, balance of payments, and financial restrictions, amongst many others, in top international specialized academic journals. He has a PhD in economics from New York University. Mr. Céspedes, please welcome.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to moderate this keynote speech by Professor Manova. Let me start by saying a few things. Productivity differentials are the key factor that explain a difference in income per capita across countries. So productivity is the main factor that we should be taking a look at, trying to understand. And this is why I think this conference is so important. Now, interestingly, the topic that one of the key issues that we're gonna talk today is about globalization. And when you look globalization, openness, and take a look on income per capita differences, you're gonna see that there is a positive correlation between growth and globalization. Now, in recent decades, many developing economies have become increasingly more integrated. So the question that arises immediately is, how can globalization can provide or become a factor to reduce productivity differentials among countries? Now, the globalization process have different configurations, and a key of this configuration is the emergence of the global value chains. In this context, we can ask several questions. One of them, what are the factors that allow countries to take advantage of global value chains, more generally from globalization? And this is a fundamental question for policy design in many developing economies. If these opportunities are there, what are the factors that can allow countries to take advantage of them? Other questions are, how can productivity be enhanced in a sustainable way in this context of globalization, in this context of global value chain? For the keynote, we have a leading expert on all this issue. Professor Manova has worked extensively in international economics and global value chains and free production networks that are a crucial element in these configurations. She holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University. She is professor of economics at UCL. She serves on the investment committee of the European Economic Association. Previously, she has been assistant professor at Stanford, visiting professor at Princeton, and also professor at Oxford University. She has been also a member of the editorial boards of the Review of Economic Studies, the American Economic Journal Economic Policy, and previously from the Journal of International Economics. She's also a research fellow at CPR and as an associate at the LSE Center for Economic Performance. As I mentioned before, she's a leading expert on the issues on globalizations, global value chain, and the factors that can somehow configure the impact that this globalization and global value chains can have in productivity. So, Professor Manova, it's a pleasure for us to have you here delivering this keynote speech. I think now we have to connect Professor Manova, that is in London, I think. Professor Manova, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this very generous introduction. It's a true pleasure to be able to contribute and listen in on some of the discussions. I see the agenda has been fascinating yesterday and today, and I hope that my remarks today will be a continuation of this important conversation that you have started. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Please do let me know if there are any technical issues during the presentation. Okay, well, the introduction just now was actually a perfect prelude for much of the message I'd like to share with you today. We're interested in enhancing productivity on a global scale, and we care about the environment that can support global growth. Given the integration among countries in many dimensions, it's therefore quite urgent to think about creating a global environment that can enable global growth. In the 20th century, there was a very fast and ready positive relationship between trade openness and aggregate GDP per capita growth. And this is a figure that many of you have probably seen before, where on the horizontal axis we rank countries by the GDP per capita annual growth over a 70-year period, and on the vertical axis we have a metric of how open they are to trade. For reference, Chile is right along this positive slope line. The 21st century has changed things for good. There has been a combination of rapid technological progress and trade policy changes, which have transformed the way we do business. And this has affected the rise of global value chains and the emergence of really widespread multinational activity. This has been accompanied by deeper financial and labor market integration among countries. And as a result of that, the world is more interconnected and interdependent than ever before. And when I think about globalization, I'd like to think of interconnectedness and interdependence as some key features that perhaps raise some concerns, but they're also the key features that raise the most hope for me for the future of global cooperation. There are intensified policy debates today. In advanced economy, there are concerns about inequality, competition from emerging markets. In developing countries, there are even more first-order concerns that have to do with aggregate welfare. And all of this in the face of weak structural institutions. And so global integration and cooperation is under fire today, but I'd like to think that chips and ships will bring us back in line as we look to the future. I'd like to organize my talk around three themes, and I will spend most of it on thinking about the role of globalization for global economic growth. Here, it's important to appreciate the complexity of globalization. Firms operate in really complex production networks that straddle multiple countries and firm boundaries. Some of this fragmentation of production is done within multinational firms, but there is also a lot of arm's-length transactions. And increasingly, we need to think about the global of organization, not only of production, but also innovation. Where does innovation take place? Who is moving the frontier? How is knowledge flowing through value chains and production networks? When we think about globalization, we also need to bear in mind that there are three important dimensions here: access to foreign markets, access to inputs sourced from abroad, and of course, import competition. And these days, luckily, we no longer forget the role of all three. It is tempting to think about import competition alone, but I think global sourcing has become quite salient. When we think about these dimensions of globalization, they certainly create a lot of opportunities for expansion, but also for growth, for putting firms and aggregate economies on steeper innovation paths. It goes through lower input costs, economies of scale, greater market access will incentivize more productivity upgrading, as well as knowledge transfer and technology spillovers. But how do we seize these opportunities? There are some challenges. Some of that is related to firms' capacity to participate in the global economy and to innovate. Some of it is the need for well-functioning markets for capital, labor, as well as output goods. And a lot of it at the core has to do with well-functioning, efficient institutions. Not just contract enforcement and rule of law, but the institutions that govern how all of those labor, capital, and product market operate. So I'll spend a lot of my time on these questions. But I want to quickly touch upon what I would like to call growth plus plus plus. Increasingly, we care about a broader agenda beyond economic growth per se. I don't think we have a very well-defined agenda. There may be differences in opinions here, but clearly some of the leading dimensions are inclusivity in terms of social and economic inequality, resilience, which I perceive to be in an economic context, and sustainability, which then comprises political stability, environmental stability, social cohesion. I personally believe that these global goals require a global effort, and they pose challenges that we can only overcome if we pull forces together. So to me, interconnectedness and interdependence are going to align incentives and provide rationale for continued efforts towards multilateralism for the future. And this multilateralism is not going to be confined to trade policy, of which, of course, we have seen a lot of step backwards in the last few years, but broadening the agenda of multilateralism to span the kind of varied reforms and dimensions of cooperation that require progress towards these growth plus 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 objectives. Let me jump in, and what I embrace fully is pointillism. So I will try to extract messages from academic research that hopefully inform these questions. And I will also occasionally highlight specific takeaways that come from individual analytic papers. So insights about the world from some anecdotes. Global value chains have been on the rise. I know yesterday you spent a lot of time thinking about these issues, different ways to illustrate this. What this figure demonstrates is from 95 to today, the share of total production that we consume domestically has been steadily declining, and instead what has been increasing are complex GVCs. So products that I produce, travel to one country, get processed further, re-exported to yet another third country. Production networks are quite complex. These days, 70 to 80% of international trade is in intermediate inputs for further processing and assembly, and a similar percentage of trade is carried out by affiliates of multinational companies. Production networks are very sparse in that there are a lot of firms that transact with a few buyers and suppliers, but most trade flows are conducted by a few smaller group of buyers and sellers that are very, very highly interconnected. And what has been shown to contribute to the formation of these complex production networks are important search and matching costs. Excuse me. Firms increasingly transact across jurisdictions, and in doing so, they need to overcome all kinds of contractual challenges. This, of course, increases their financing and insurance costs of operation, but it also points to the role of institutional strength. Excuse me. So why do we think that globalization can put firms on a steeper growth path? On the one hand, it can improve performance given current productivity, but it can also improve productivity through technological progress. When we think about firms' performance, we care about competitiveness and profitability. And those will depend on your own productivity, as well as the costs of your imported inputs and the quality you're able to produce. Globalization allows you to lower your costs because you can source inputs more widely at a lower cost, presumably of higher quality, so you can also improve your output quality. But beyond improving performance, given your current productivity, access to foreign markets and pressure by competition, including import competition, can be very important drivers of innovation and adoption. Why? Because of economies of scale and the high costs involved in those kind of technological processes. Importantly, there's significant knowledge transfer across borders. Some of that is active. Firms are actively investing in acquiring new equipment that allows them to upgrade their technological processes. A lot of it is passive. There's learning by doing, there's know-how transfer when you interact with buyers and suppliers. There is more direct spillovers from multinationals to their foreign subsidiaries, as well as to arm's length partners they transact with. And this kind of know-how can improve your management practices, I will come back to that in a moment, and lower your production costs that way. But it can also improve your ability to operate in foreign markets by increasing your market expertise. Of course, it is also a critical component to innovation. Finally, it is worth pointing out that fragmenting production is not just doing business as usual, it is changing the way firms function. It is effectively a new technological process. When you shift your position in the value chain, you have an opportunity to reorganize the kind of activities you're doing in-house and the kind of activities you're effectively outsourcing to independent parties. And this has implications for task complexity and the kind of workers you employ. But importantly, by reorganizing production, this might change your incentives and opportunities for innovative activity. I will come back to that as well. So clearly there are opportunities for growth in a global environment. What are the challenges that firms face? To capitalize on these opportunities, firms need information, they need knowledge of the technological frontier, they need the capability to participate in value chains and to innovate or upgrade, and they have to have the right incentives. So from the firm's perspective, it has to be optimal. The cost-benefit analysis have to tip the balance in the direction of innovation and growing. What are the costs? Well, there's a lot of matching and transacting costs. They're the costs of production and sourcing inputs. And then looking downstream, they're the costs of sales, distribution. Focusing specifically on innovation, they're the R&D costs associated with innovation. What are the benefits? You want to improve your market competitiveness. You want to have access to a wider consumer market where you can deploy your new innovations. And you want to be assured innovation returns in those markets. So I'd like to think of that as prerequisites that are at the firm level, at the market level, and the institutional level. At the firm level, we need to have know-how. Oftentimes, in empirical analysis, we think about productivity in very clear ways, but we can measure it imprecisely only as a black box residual. Instead, I'd like to suggest that one very tangible component of productivity that seems to matter a lot for predicting firm performance is managerial competence. So implementing the right management practices that enable production as well as innovation. So these firm prerequisites, know-how and managerial competence, I think are critical to being able to deliver on efficiency and quality. Scale matters. This is where we come to market size, because a lot of investments, of course, require enormous sunk costs and fixed costs. Market prerequisites. Firms want to operate in environments with efficient capital and labor markets that allow them to source the talent they need and tap the finance they require. They also want efficient product markets. They need effective information that supports efficient contracting and contract enforcement. This is both because they're transacting across borders and because they're undertaking costly R&D and innovation activities. Finally, because of all the matching and transaction costs associated with production networks, firms benefit greatly from the emergence of services that support their activities. Increasingly, we see services becoming an important share of total economic activity for developed countries. Some of those services directly support the kind of manufacturing production networks that we're perhaps more used to thinking about. So logistics and transportation are some examples of that. When we think about capital, we do want to make a distinction between financial, physical, and human capital. All three matter, but importantly, we are increasingly realizing the role of human capital and knowledge. Study after study documents that limited know-how is a very key bottleneck. It's not just about access to credit and machinery that restrict technology adoption and innovation in poor countries. And various studies have tried to unpack that. And what we see is that skilled people are important for adopting ICT technologies. We see that setting the right incentives, having the right management practices that set the right incentives really matter for encouraging workers to adopt new technologies. And finally, assigning new managers to firms have an opportunity to reshape firm operations and performance. So in other words, you need the knowledge. You need the people that will be complementary to equipment to implement that knowledge. And you need to have the right management practices in place to incentivize people on the job, and of course to coordinate the entire production and innovation process. So let me jump to a few individual studies I have done with colleagues. I should have mentioned, whenever there's a little globe up there on your screen, this signals that I'm kind of extracting messages that emerge from a large academic literature. And instead, whenever there's a little light bulb, that kind of brings up messages from specific individual papers. So let me jump right into it. When we think about firm performance, what are the dimensions that matter? Efficiency, quality, capacity. We want firms to produce at low cost. We want firms to have the capacity to produce high quality. And the reason why it's important to appreciate those two dimensions is because when we think about what moves us forward in innovation, these are the two dimensions we want to be improving along. Not just efficiency, not just quality, both matter. In some work for China, for example, I have shown that firms that are more successful in foreign markets are the ones that are producing higher quality, and they do that by importing inputs of higher quality. So on the left-hand side here, behind this cloud, is a very strong positive correlation between input quality and output quality. On the right-hand side, a very strong correlation between output quality and export success. Where do efficiency and quality come from? In some other work, together with co-authors, we have seen that management practices are first order. There's tremendous heterogeneity in management competence across firms, of course, in any given economy, as well as a lot of variation across countries on average. So the World Management Surveys provide the glimpse into that. On the left-hand side here, you have average management scores across countries. Latin America is shaded in this teal blue color, and Chile does quite well, I should add, ahead of Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Nicaragua. On the right-hand side, you have a very suggestive correlation between these average country-level management practices and average country-level exports. Of course, this is just a simple correlation. Extensive analytical work we have done with detailed firm-level data suggests that management matters at the firm level as well. So we've studied this question both in China and the US. In both very different economic contexts, you see that firms with better management practices are able to use higher quality inputs, adopt more complex technologies, and produce more efficiently. Together, this allows them to achieve much more superior export performance. What is perhaps good news is that management interventions can work. There was a consulting intervention in India years ago, and data was collected up to 10 years thereafter. And what you see in this figure is the positive, long-lasting effects of this management consulting on the practices firms were employing even 10 years out. So what you see in blue are the plans of firms that receive the Council League services. Huge improvements. What you see in green are big improvements in management practices, even in plans that belong to the same firm but were not directly treated. So clearly a lot of information sharing among plans within the same company. And even more encouraging, there is a lot of learning by doing, as well as a lot of knowledge spillovers across firms. So even in control plans that were neighbors to these treatment plans, you saw some positive effects, albeit not as long-lasting. So I have talked about, if you will, limiting factors at the firm level. Efficiency matters, quality capacity matters. How do you get those? You need to up your game, and management practices seems to be a very important, tangible component of that. What also matters are opportunities for reorganizing production. So when we think about technology, it could be, can I use the same manufacturing process more efficiently? Or instead, can I adopt an altogether different manufacturing process? Production fragmentation, the emergence of buyer-supplier production networks, is more about the latter. It is about a new way of doing business, a new way of manufacturing. In several projects, I'm trying to understand how this production fragmentation, in fact, creates new opportunities for technological firms inside firms, for technological change inside firms. One project looks at the fragmentation of production domestically within Belgium. And what we find, and it's not surprising, that when you're able to outsource inputs that you're not very good at, this lowers your input costs, raises your profits, and overall, your participation in the production network becomes a very important the determinant of your firm size and performance. In current work on Brazil, I'm trying to understand how fragmenting production is correlated with the way you organize production in-house. What we're seeing is that firms that outsource certain activities to suppliers tend to retain in-house the more complex production steps. As a result of that, they restructure their employment composition towards more skilled occupations, and also within occupations towards more skilled and better paid workers. So there is this complementarity between reorganizing production processes in-house and more effectively participating in production networks. This generates aggregate efficiency gains. From a policy perspective, of course, there will be implications for the wage distribution and the labor share. This is what we're focusing and trying to understand better right now. I have also done some work on China, where you can think about production fragmentation in a different way. Think about processing trade. Think about positioning in your value chain in terms of the upstreamness of the inputs that you acquire from independent suppliers and the downstreamness of the products that you sell to your customers. You can think about the gap between the upstreamness of your purchased inputs and the downstreamness of your sales as the span of production stages that you're performing in-house. So what we found in China using long horizon panel data was that as firms become bigger, more productive, and more experienced in foreign markets, they're actually expanding along the supply chain. They're able to conduct more production stages and at the same time earn higher profits. So this goes counter some priors that you grow by specializing in narrow segments of production stages. Instead, it suggests that in some developing countries, you might have this process where you first start by doing a very small sliver of the entire value chain, but as you gain in experience and size, you're able to spread into more production steps, and that makes you more productive in turn and more profitable. So I have talked about production fragmentation as a technological jump. I now like to start shifting gears and thinking about what are market constraints that matter, what are institutional conditions that matter. I'd like to mention a couple of aspects of markets. One is market competition. And since later we'll be talking about institutions, that will be the context in which I can discuss labor market frictions or capital market frictions. Instead, I'd like to briefly talk about product market competitiveness. So how do we think about regulating product markets effectively from the perspective of consumers? In production networks, we're starting to understand this better and better. I have some recent work which actually looks at how changes in the market structure upstream in China has been benefiting downstream firms and ultimately final consumers elsewhere. And in particular, I've been working with firm-level data for Chile and France. Within the horizon that we studied, there was tremendous entry in China, and so the market was becoming a lot more competitive within narrowly defined product categories. On the left-hand side, you see what happened at the start of that period in year 2000. There's a very skewed distribution of the number of Chinese firms that were selling a given product to Chile. Fast forward, and that distribution became much more spread out. And so using careful analysis and very rich firm-level data, what we're able to document is that within a firm over time, within a Chilean firm over time, being able to source from more upstream suppliers in China drastically lowered firms' input prices. This was able to improve the downstream performance and profits. And in turn, this raised consumer welfare. So what you're seeing here on the right-hand side, it's a plot that illustrates that sourcing inputs from more suppliers results in lower input costs. And we have grouped Chilean firms into 20 bins based on activity to more cleanly illustrate that relationship. One takeaway from this project has been that there's a lot of spillover of policy that we normally think of as behind the border policy across borders. When you think about market entry or market regulation in one economy, any form of industrial policy will have repercussions abroad, and this came up earlier in the introduction session as well. Another dimension I wanted to highlight when we think about markets and what market features enable firm performance. We're used to thinking about production networks and manufacturing and even services sort of as silos. But of course, there are a lot of complementarities across these. In particular, there's synergies between services that enable production fragmentation and production networks. So increasingly, we see a growing role for trade intermediation. This is one example of logistic support, which can take the form of just distribution services, or it can spread out to cover also financial services. Some intermediaries engaged in matchmaking, essentially bringing together buyers and suppliers. Some of them are simply transacting, completing the transactions that buyers and suppliers have mutually agreed to perform. Trade intermediaries specialize in overcoming the kind of trade and financial and contracting costs that would otherwise deter some of these cross-border activity. And so again, using rich data for Chile, firm-level data for Chile, what we've been studying is the role that import intermediaries play in widening and deepening production networks. In other words, widening the production network by enabling more buyer-supplier matches, and deepening the production network by increasing the value of those transactions. Ultimately, this of course trickles down to higher consumer welfare. What I've chosen to show you here on the top left is just the systematic relationship between the share of Chilean imports that are conducted by trade intermediaries and distance to the origin country, again grouping countries into 20 bins. More distant countries benefit from more intermediation services. Bottom right, origin countries with weaker logistics performance indices require much more trade intermediation. So in other words, the evidence suggests that there are important search and match and transaction costs, especially when crossing borders, but specialized market makers can really enable production networks to flourish. Let me now turn to the role of institutions. This, of course, is a really, really big topic. I will have to narrow it down and think about digestible bits that have some policy action. What institutions matter? It's very easy to say all institutions should be perfect and then everything is good. Can we go beyond that? In early work, I have thought a lot about the role of financial institutions and the importance of having access to credit. When we think about aggregate productivity, I did some interesting work showing that financially less developed economies suffer from both lower growth and higher aggregate volatility. And intuitively what happens is that there are normal business cycle fluctuations. Normally, during a downturn in the economy, the opportunity cost of long-term investment is low. And that is a time when you can do more long-term investment that long-term benefits growth. As a result of that, aggregate long-term growth is on average higher, and this counter-cyclical investment in capital goods dampens overall volatility. Unfortunately, when firms face tight credit constraints, all of this gets reversed. And instead what happens is that financial frictions end up amplifying business cycles, and that results in higher aggregate volatility. In addition, financial frictions lead to lower investment in long-term capital goods, which also drags down aggregate growth. So in other words, less developed countries have lower growth, higher aggregate volatility, worse relationship between growth and volatility. In more recent work, I have tried to think about the effects of trade openness on aggregate productivity, looking at both import competition and export access. Here, theoretically, it's complex. When you have misallocation of resources, the world operates in a second-best environment, which means that on the margin, any kind of policy interventions, such as trade liberalization or trade reversals, will have theoretically ambiguous effects. Yes, we know that misallocated economies perform worse than well-functioning economies. But if you take two economies with different degrees of misallocation and you shock them with the same trade reform, it is very hard to predict which one will benefit more on the margin. In practice, what empirical work using some data from CompNet put together by the ECB, what that kind of empirical analysis showed was that there is important asymmetry between the impact of export expansion and import competition on aggregate productivity. In particular, strong rule of law and efficient capital, labor, and product markets dampened the aggregate productivity gains from further export expansion. One rationale for that is that countries that have well-functioning institutions have already maxed out the potential gains from exporting. Further liberalizations don't generate as much marginal gains for them compared to countries that are starting out with much worse institutions. On the flip side, we see that strong rule of law and efficient capital, labor, and product markets in fact amplify the gains from further import competition. And here we have to think, why is that asymmetry? My hunch is that it has to do with whether shocks are positive or negative from the perspective of domestic firms. The takeaway that isn't, of course, unpleasant for any policymaker is that these complex interactions among different kinds of policy interventions complicate the optimal packaging and sequencing of these reforms. Let me take a moment to talk specifically about the effects of finance on international trade and multinational activity. Given that we're thinking about a global environment, which provides opportunities for global growth and innovation, is finance a constraint? All firms require external capital to operate, but exporters are much more dependent on external finance than domestic producers because they incur specific trade-related costs, longer processing times, greater transaction risks. And so there's a very active market for the financing and insurance of international trade. Guesstimates put that at roughly 90% of world trade. And in recent years, there has been recurrent concern about the trade finance gap among multilateral organizations. What we know as a takeaway from this literature is that financial friction severely impede aggregate trade, and this operates through all relevant margins. It goes through fewer firms being able to export at lower export volumes with narrower positions of the global value chain. These effects are much more severe for smaller firms, as well as for sectors that are especially reliant on external finance for their operations. and sectors that have very few tangible assets that can provide collateral. This is problematic because when we think about innovation and growth, a lot of the high-tech industries are indeed the ones that face significant upfront sunk costs, and that makes them especially financially sensitive. Moreover, the effects of financial frictions on aggregate trade are far greater than those on just overall output distortions, and these effects are quite acute during financial crises. Beyond effects on trade, there's also a lot of literature showing that financial conditions matter for the pattern of multinational operations. Most people's priors would be that multinational companies are not credit constrained. It is true that they're certainly in a position to arbitrage cross-country differences in the cost of capital and essentially raise finance where they can and deploy it where they need. They can only partially arbitrage this though. And the reason is that cross-country differences in contract enforcement makes it very, very hard sometimes for financiers from the rich developed world to fund operations in emerging economies for fear of risk of expropriation and very severe asymmetric information about what's happening on the ground. And so in practice, what we see in data is that multinationals try and raise finance locally, the local financial market, as much as they can. When that is not possible, they do rely on injections of equity and debt financing from the parent company, which only partially, though, compensates for any local shortfall in financing. As a result of that, when host countries improve their financial institutions overall, this attracts more entry by foreign multinationals. And it also re-incentivizes them to produce less for the local market, but instead export more to other destinations. It is important to note that foreign capital flows do in fact compensate for weak local financial development. This is evidenced both when you look at equity market reforms as well as when you think about multinational companies, so foreign direct investment. In both cases, you see that an injection of foreign capital flows tends to benefit aggregate trade activity, and this benefit is greater when the country starts out with less developed financial markets. In the interest of time, let me skip a couple of slides that you can certainly refer to later and jump straight to one that has the most direct policy implication. A lot of the work in this area of trade and finance is thought about financing, less about insurance. Increasingly, international trade requires more insurance because of the rising economic and political risks. And so on the left-hand side here, you see a graph spanning about 15 years where the red solid line shows you total trade values. And the top dashed line shows you the rise in the share of this trade that is insured. So starting in 2005, about 8% of global trade required some form of trade insurance. 15 years later, that ratio has almost doubled to about 15%. Moreover, we know little about trade insurance, partly because of data limitations, but we do know that they're both private and public players. And on the right-hand side, what we see very clearly is that the riskier the destination country is, the more important public insurance becomes. So the ratio of private insurance in total insurance declines steadily with the overall aggregate risk index of these destination countries. So this is all very new evidence coming from recently released data I've been working with from two institutions. One is AKF, which is the export credit agency specifically of Denmark. And that's quite fun, disaggregated data, where we are able to study some of these patterns at the firm level as well. But the figures that I'm showing you here are actually based on very aggregate comprehensive data coming from the Bear Union, which is the association, of course, of the export credit agencies around the world. So the takeaway message is that there are certain market failures in the financial sector which do benefit from ECA financing. And so there is rationale for that kind of intervention in especially tight private markets. So in my last, I'm not sure how much time I have left. I think in my last 5 minutes, I'd like to talk about global innovation and spillover. So I've talked about opportunities for growth. Let's now think about, well, where does innovation actually happen? Traditionally, we're used to thinking about innovation happening in advanced countries and perhaps making its way to developing countries via knowledge transfer. And some of that might come just from trading goods. Some of it might come through foreign direct investment. And there's been a lot of mechanisms documented in this literature about the pattern for technology diffusion from multinationals to their buyers and suppliers, as well as through employee turnover. Some of the benefits of FDI activity actually arise not just from technology diffusion, but from changing up the market environment in a given country. So in particular, the more open you are to trade and FDI, the tougher market competition at home is, which of course can incentivize domestic firms to trim their fat and upgrade technology. So let's think about multinationals. Multinationals conduct the vast majority of global R&D. They manage very complex production networks worldwide. What is interesting is that increasingly offshore R&D as well. So they're not just doing R&D at their headquarters and fragmenting production across the globe, they're also innovating all over the world. So here are a couple of anecdotes, very well recognized German car brands. So Mercedes-Benz opened its 6th R&D lab where? In Seattle, in the US, and this was going to be a digital hub for cloud computing. But increasingly, we see offshoring of R&D activities also to emerging economies. And notably, BMW opened a very large R&D facility in Shanghai, where it had been doing production for a while, also to specialize in innovation, digital services, autonomous driving. So in some recent work, I've been looking at the operations of German multinationals. Germany is, of course, a leader, not just in foreign direct investment, but also in the innovation frontier. So that's why it's a very interesting context to study. And what I'm showing you in this figure is where German multinationals innovate patents. Patent data is actually sometimes much more comprehensive than R&D reported on firms' balance sheets. So we have the universe of patents produced by multinationals. We know where they were invented, and you see that quite often this happens abroad, in both rich and poor countries. In fact, 43% of German multinationals create patents abroad. The top 5 hubs are the US, Austria, France, Switzerland, and the UK, but notably China and India are in the top 15. And by looking at globally how many patents originate in different countries, the inventors of how many patents are based in different countries, we were also able to characterize different countries' comparative advantage in innovation in different sectors. And top 3 technological areas would not surprise you. So for example, Germany is especially good in organic chemistry, so pharmaceuticals, energy and transportation. The US does very well in medical technology and IT. And looking at the rich German data, we could then also confirm that when multinationals offshore their innovation globally, they are responding, they are following to countries' comparative advantage in innovation. So in other words, we don't just offshore production following comparative advantage in production, we're also offshoring innovation following comparative advantage in innovation. More interestingly, you might ask, well, what kind of innovation is it? This literature distinguishes between basic and applied innovation, where basic R&D is something that doesn't deliver marketable gains immediately, but is sort of a prerequisite for more successful applied innovation tomorrow. Interestingly, we see that 7% of German firms offshore innovation, to countries where they do have an affiliate, 17% only to countries where they don't have an affiliate, and about 16% to both countries with affiliates and without. And we realized that there was a very clear relationship between production and innovation fragmentation. In particular, there are synergies between applied innovation and production, because you want to be doing them close together, where production floor managers can tell you exactly what the problem is that the applied researchers can address today. Multinationals therefore tend to bundle applied innovation with production in developing countries, where of course production processes are more attractively cheap. By contrast, basic R&D is mostly done in rich economies. They might not be your favorite production base because they're expensive countries to operate in, but that's where the knowledge base is when it comes down to basic R&D activity. because climate has come up and is extremely important, I've also been thinking about the role of multinationals as climate changers. Yes, there are very controversial discussions about offshoring pollution versus spillover of clean technology across borders. So this was an opportunity to shed light on that question, on that controversy as well. This is working with some very rich data for Brazil. This figure shows you that emissions per worker, 5 different pollutants, vary a lot across different regions in Brazil, as does the extent of multinational activity. Using some rich data for Brazilian firms, as well as the employer-employee turnover among firms, we're able to establish 2 interesting results. We saw that multinationals are on average cleaner than domestic firms. You might say, okay, but maybe they're still choosing to subcontract dirtier activities to domestic firms. Instead, what we see systematically is that multinationals in fact help domestic firms get cleaner as well. And this works through employee turnover. So the evidence indicates that when domestic firms hire workers away from a foreign multinational, they tend to improve their own pollution practices, environmental practices, through better knowledge and implementation capacity. Innovation doesn't come only from the West anymore. And developing countries are not just adopting, they can actually also be pushing the innovation frontier. So there is leapfrogging happening. This is a cute little example in the autonomous driving industry, where a Chinese company, AutoX, actually bet the US one, Waymo, to the punch by 6 or 12 months, depending on how you want to do it. And so the last figure I wanted to show you is a glimpse into global innovation in emerging economies. We have a lot of innovation leaders in emerging economies, and the question is, okay, they have the human capacity to do that. Do they have the incentive to do it? I've been doing some analysis of how emerging economies choose to patent abroad. You might think that Chinese firms take out patents in the US or Europe just to segment their market power in that market. Instead, when you look at the data, obtaining a US patent increases firms' global sales, not just to the US or European market. And the evidence suggests that this is because the US patent provides a global stamp of approval. So emerging economies might have the knowledge to conduct cutting-edge research, but they also need this global stamp of approval in order to tap the foreign market, in order to be able to be competitive. The evidence we interpret as consistent with patent approval, signaling the firm's capacity to produce high quality and credibility to honor contracts. So a takeaway from a policy perspective is that weak intellectual property rights protection or weak institutions in developing countries is not just deterring inbound FDI, but perhaps also host R&D. So let me close by saying a lot of firm, market, and institutional contexts need to be aligned for globalization to take place and for it to engender growth. If we want to broaden the objectives to what I'll describe as growth plus, the agenda becomes even more ambitious. So I'm not going to belabor this point, as I know you will be talking about this in the sessions to come. So let me just close with this cheeky motivational poster, which is so outdated that perhaps it's trendy yet again. You can't spell challenge without change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Manova, for this very insightful presentation. I think we have 15 minutes for questions, less, 10 minutes for questions. So I'm gonna open the floor for questions for Professor Manova, and let me see if we have one first. Okay, let me start by asking myself a question. So it's very, very interesting what you said about how global value chains somehow can describe the different stages of development of a country. As you mentioned, you have some comparative advantage initially. Imagine labor force, plenty of labor force, so low wages. So you start basically building on that. And then if you have access to credit, if you have good management, then you can start being more efficient and also increasing the quality of the good. So it's a sort of a movement from adoption towards innovation in terms of the macro development literature. So what are your thoughts in terms of countries whose main comparative advantage, in a traditional definition of comparative advantage, are natural resources? So a lot of countries that export primary products have become more integrated in recent decades. However, some paths for these countries or for some countries, this path has been different to the ones that you described. So how can those countries take advantage of what you mentioned in terms of the factors that can trigger increases in productivity that sustain higher level of welfare for the countries?
Thank you. This is, of course, a very, very challenging question. It's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. I think this is one where it's really difficult. So I think looking backwards, I think it is fair to say that different segments of the value chain were associated with different profitability levels, and perhaps more concerningly, with different prospects for technological progress and sort of improvement in profitability over time. There are a few studies in the development literature, for example, that trace out very well-defined supply chains that start with commodities or agricultural products, and they trace out the participation of firms along the value chain and the rent sharing and the profit accumulation. The message is not rosy. So, I can think of examples that look at the fishing industry, the coffee industry, the cut flower market. However, I'd like to take a more enlightened perspective on this. Value chains have created opportunities for countries to essentially jump onto the value chain even when they're not able to complete the entire process on their own. So some of the evidence for China leads me to these more optimistic conclusions. So from the perspective of individual firms, you might not have the productivity level, the knowledge, or the access to finance to produce a dress from scratch. However, if you're able to import some inputs and just complete the activities that you are capable of, then you will be able to participate, export that dress, participate in the value chain. In time, you can build yourself up along the supply chain. So that is obviously a very rosy view, but I think it's worth highlighting it because it has been the experience of many firms and economies. Now, of course, natural resources and commodities are especially relevant, and I think we need to think about the food sector in particular too. When we think about commodities, we think about chips and certain problems in supply chains in the last few years. When we think about food, we think about global resilience and potential food shortages. I am the perennial optimist. Perhaps it makes me naive. Perhaps there is some kernel of truth to it. I'd like to think that there's constant technological progress, and essentially humanity can innovate its way out of these kind of bottlenecks. This gives me hope also for the economic implications of different countries. And so in particular, if you think 30, 40 years ago, we probably never thought of agriculture as a segment of the economy where you can experience dramatic industrial progress. Mm-hmm. But we have seen so much technological innovation, and some of it is the better machines we've adopted. A lot of it is, genetics and different crops, design and utilization. And so therefore, looking to the future, I cannot imagine exactly what technology will emerge, but I do believe that new technologies will emerge. And I think that can actually flip things around, and some segments of the value chain that were less profitable today might become more profitable tomorrow. And some segments of the value chain that featured lower scope for technological progress might actually become the domain of very fast technological progress.
Thank you. I don't know if we have some question from the audience. No question from the audience? Okay, so Professor Manova, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it has been extremely, extremely useful for all the participants of this conference to have you here, to learn from your research, from your knowledge on this area. So why don't we give her a round of applause again. Thank you very much, Professor Manova.
Thank you, my pleasure entirely.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much, Luis Felipe. And now on to our next session. Please welcome our moderator for the next panel, Regulatory and Competition Frameworks for Productive Investment, Ms. Maria Luisa Huidobro Yareva, Senior Advisor in the Ministry of Economy and Digital Transformation of Spain. With an impressive trajectory in the public sector, Ms. Huidobro specialized in energy issues and has been part of numerous strategic boards, both in public and private companies. Bienvenida, María Luisa. Encantados de tenerte aquí.
I would like first to thank the OECD for organizing this very interesting seminar, supporting, and to the Chilean government for hosting it. And thank you all for coming to the session, Regulatory and Competition Framework for Productive Investment. We are all concerned, I am sure, about this relevant issue since productivity growth is influenced by a range of factors, and most studies suggest that there is no simple way to boost it. The degree of competition in a particular country or sector is often considered to be among the most important of such factors, since a lack of competition reduces the pressure on firms